702 pages. Numbered. Filed. Signed inside the Central Intelligence Agency in May 1973 when James Schlesinger ordered his own officers to write down anything the agency had done that might fall outside its charter. Not rumors, not leaks. Internal admissions collected under deadline in bureaucratic prose then locked away for 34 years. That is the first fracture in the story. The most dangerous knowledge is not always erased. Sometimes it is formatted, stapled, indexed, and buried inside the official record so completely that public memory never catches up to it. Washington was still moving through the aftershock of Watergate. The language of accountability was already in the air. Congress was restless. Journalists were circling. Inside the agency, the instinct was not confession, but inventory. Someone wanted to know where the institutional explosives were stored before the building caught fire. So a directive went out. 2 weeks. Put it in writing. Anything that could become a problem later. And they did. Surveillance of Americans. Assassination plots involving foreign leaders. Drug testing without consent. Physical break-ins. Operations that were not supposed to exist, written in the calm tone of men who assumed the audience would always remain internal. That tone matters. These pages were not drafted for a courtroom or a textbook. They were written for a sealed system speaking to itself. The second fracture is quieter and worse. If an agency can produce 702 pages about conduct it considered dangerous to acknowledge even internally, what never made it into the file? A record like this does not reveal the whole machine. It reveals the edge of what the machine was willing to admit to itself. For decades, the public did not confront the document itself. It sat in a vault while presidencies changed. Wars began and ended. Scandals rose and cooled into history. Only in 2007, after a 15-year FOIA fight, did the file surface in declassified form. Even then, it arrived not as a national reckoning, but as an archive event, officially available, practically invisible. That is the pattern this video enters. Not secrecy as darkness, but secrecy as procedure. Not a missing file, but a file that exists too neatly. A date, a signature, a box number, a shelf. The record survives. Public recognition does not. The question is no longer whether institutions hide things. The question is more precise and more unsettling. How much of modern history was never destroyed at all, only arranged in such a way that almost nobody would ever read it? Before the breach became visible, the system looked almost reasonable. American power in the 20th century ran on paper. Decisions moved as memoranda, cables, annexes, hearing transcripts, field reports, pathology notes, radar logs, classified estimates. A war could be reduced to a briefing folder. A covert action could survive as a line item, a routing slip, a typed paragraph initialed in the margin. The state did not only act, it recorded itself acting. That record gave off the appearance of order. Agencies had charters, archives had procedures. Classification had levels, dates, handlers, storage rules. In theory, this was how a democracy balanced secrecy with accountability. The public might not know now, but the paper would remain. One day the file could be opened. That promise shaped the culture around it. Journalists chased statements. Presidents received summaries. Universities taught the official episode, not the appendix behind it. Citizens learned to confuse not public yet with not knowable at all. The bureaucracy benefited from that confusion. A fact did not have to disappear. It only had to be absorbed into a system too technical, too slow, or too vast for ordinary attention. At the micro level, the machinery was banal. A clerk feeds another sheet into a typewriter. A classification officer stamps a cover page. A military analyst condenses uncertainty into cleaner language for a superior who does not want friction in the sentence. In a hospital, a form is filed under research. In an Air Force office, an unexplained sighting is coded, numbered, shelved. In an archive, a box receives a reference number and goes cold for decades. No dramatic music, just folders closing. At the macro level, the arrangement was elegant and dangerous. Institutions could later say the material had always existed. They were often technically right. The missing element was not documentation. It was encounter. Access depended on time, money, persistence, litigation, geography, clearance, or the private obsession of someone willing to read what everyone else stepped around. That is the world before the first real crack in this story. Not a dictatorship of vanished records, but a republic of retained ones. The public record was not empty. It was stratified. Official statements floated at the surface. Beneath them sat the denser layer. Annexes, internal histories, raw files, after-action corrections, where institutions wrote down what they could not yet afford to say aloud. And once that structure is in place, the next step becomes almost inevitable. The truth does not arrive as revelation. It arrives when one document slips upward from the lower layer and shows in plain administrative language that the system knew far more than it admitted. The first real break did not begin with a gunshot, a raid, or a dramatic confession. It began with paper leaving the building. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg carried portions of a classified Defense Department study out of the secure world where it had been meant to remain. The document was massive, a secret history of American decision-making in Vietnam, commissioned by Robert McNamara, assembled by dozens of analysts, built from cables, memoranda, and internal assessments stretching back years. Its significance was not that it contained a single explosive sentence. Its significance was cumulative. Page after page showed a government expanding a war while privately acknowledging limits, doubts, and distortions that never reached the public in full. At first, the instinct around the material was still rationalization. Officials argued that publication would damage national security. Editors treated it as a press battle. Lawyers reduced it to prior restraint and constitutional language. Even the scandal arrived in procedural clothes. But the underlying shock was more severe. The archive was no longer passive. A buried record had begun to move upward into public time. The scene narrows. A photocopier running late at night. Hands feeding sheets one at a time. Classification markings cut from pages. Boxes, folders, borrowed rooms, the soft mechanical rhythm of duplication. The state had produced an internal history for itself. One analyst decided the internal audience was no longer sufficient. Then the reaction widened. Newsrooms hardened into fronts in a legal war. The Nixon administration sought injunctions. Federal judges moved quickly. For 15 days, the country watched a constitutional argument unfold around documents most people had not read and could not physically access. Yet behavior shifted before comprehension caught up. Trust bent first. The full evidentiary weight would come later. That is how these breaks often happen. The social effect outruns the reading. The deeper fracture sat inside the papers themselves. They did not merely suggest that officials had misled the public. They showed a system capable of filtering reality as it traveled upward and outward, into briefings, speeches, testimony, strategy. The distance between internal assessment and public language was not accidental noise. It was part of governance. That is the moment the pattern becomes visible. Not secrecy as the absence of documentation, but secrecy as compartmentalized knowledge. The file exists. The state reads it. Policy proceeds beside it. And only when someone forces the record across the membrane, from vault to court, from annex to front page, does the public begin to see that the official version was never the whole account, only its most manageable surface. Once the pattern appears in one institution, it becomes harder to contain in one scandal. The viewer is no longer looking at a single leak or a single war. The frame widens. One archive leads to another, and the same architecture keeps reappearing under different names, in different decades, with different human costs. In Air Force files, 701 cases in Project Blue Book remain formally marked unidentified after 12,618 investigations. In Manhattan Project medical records, patients were injected with plutonium without informed consent so the state could measure how radioactive material moved through the human body. Different agencies, different vocabularies, the same administrative instinct. Record the anomaly, control the interpretation, limit the public encounter. This is where the story begins to tighten. Officials closed Blue Book in 1969 and announced that further study is unlikely to serve science or national defense. But closure is not resolution. The unresolved cases remain in the archive, numbered and preserved, their explanatory gap frozen into the record. In another sector of government, physicians and administrators reduce human beings to case designations and dosage levels. A man with broken bones becomes HP12. A body becomes a measurement problem. A moral breach is translated into technical language and filed. The public does not react to these discoveries all at once. That is part of the mechanism. News arrives in fragments. A journalist finds one thread. An archive researcher pulls another. Congress notices only when the paper trail becomes too large to dismiss. Universities often absorb the episode as a narrow case study, stripping away the deeper implication that these were not isolated deviations, but recurring functions of large systems protecting themselves through documentation and delay. At the micro level, the details are almost intolerably quiet. A syringe prepared in a hospital room. A pilot dictating what he saw over a military air corridor. A clerk assigning a case number. A box returned to storage. No single gesture looks historic while it is happening. The scale becomes visible only later when the files are read side by side. And that is the escalation. The contradiction is no longer between truth and falsehood. It is between official acknowledgement and public meaning. The state can admit a fact without allowing it to become socially real. It can preserve evidence without permitting recognition. By then, the archive is no longer a warehouse of the past. It is an active machine for managing when reality is allowed to surface, in what form, and at what cost. At the center of this pattern sits the most uncomfortable fact of all. Disclosure does not necessarily resolve anything. Sometimes it does the opposite. It expands the perimeter of the known while leaving the mechanism intact. That is what happened when tens of thousands of pages tied to the Kennedy assassination were released in March 2025. The public expectation was simple, almost cinematic. Somewhere inside the archive there would be a final switch, one decisive page that would confirm or collapse the familiar story. Instead, the record behaved the way bureaucratic records usually behave. It did not deliver a single revelation. It exposed density. More than 77,000 pages entered circulation. Memoranda, operational traces, foreign contacts, internal assessments, fragments of surveillance culture, pieces of a much wider intelligence world moving around the assassination rather than neatly explaining it. The Warren Commission's central conclusion was not formally overturned, but the environment around that conclusion grew thicker, stranger, and harder to reduce. The file did not close the case. It documented how much institutional activity had always existed around it. This is the point where the convenient explanation fails, not because a simpler conspiracy replaces it, but because the archive shows something more structurally disturbing. Official history often rests on a thin public summary, while the state continues to generate a far larger parallel record beneath it. That lower record contains context, contradiction, operational texture, and evidence of priorities that rarely survive translation into mass understanding. The reaction followed a familiar pattern. Headlines searched for the one sensational line. Commentators asked whether anything new had appeared. Historians and archive researchers worked more slowly, reading laterally instead of vertically, noticing not just what one document said, but what the accumulation revealed about intelligence practice, foreign interference, covert access, and the scale of activity that remained peripheral to public memory for decades. The first response wanted closure. The documents offered topology. At the human level, the scene is almost austere. Researchers scrolling scan after scan, names resurfacing, routing slips, redactions, cable language, bureaucratic shorthand that once moved between desks without public consequence. At the systemic level, something colder emerges. The archive is not merely preserving history. It is preserving the unequal relationship between what institutions know in detail and what societies are permitted to understand in outline. That is the core wound in this story. The state does not need to destroy the record to control reality. It can release it in bulk, late, intact enough to be defensible, vast enough to be unread, and still keep the deepest layer of meaning out of reach. In the end, the strongest concealment is not the locked drawer. It is the open archive. By then, the pattern has moved beyond any single scandal, program, or administration. The final scale is infrastructural. The United States National Archives holds more than 2 billion textual records alongside photographs, films, maps, sound recordings, and born digital files. Much of it is legally accessible. Much of it is also functionally distant, uncatalogued in detail, only partially digitized, physically dispersed, searchable only if someone already knows what to ask for and where to stand when asking it. That is the last turn in the story. The problem is no longer only secrecy. It is volume as a method of disappearance. A document can be declassified and still remain socially absent. It can sit in a box in College Park or in a scanned collection no ordinary person will ever open, or inside a finding aid written in language too technical for anyone outside the system. Officially, nothing is hidden. Practically, almost everything still is. The record survives, but encounter becomes rare enough to mimic erasure. At the micro level, the image is almost silent. A researcher in a reading room turning acid-free folders under fluorescent light, a cart rolling across polished floors, a request slip filled out in pencil, a screen loading another scan with names, dates, redactions, cross-references. No explosion, no raid, no dramatic reveal. Just labor, time, eye strain, persistence, history returning one page at a time. At the mass level, the effect is colder. Public memory forms around what circulates, not around what merely exists. Schools teach the summary. Media compress the archive into a headline. Institutions can point to availability while knowing that scale itself filters the audience. A fact that is technically public but physically unreachable behaves for society almost exactly like a fact still under seal. So the final residue is not certainty. It is pressure. These stories do not prove that every hidden file contains a revelation. They show something more durable and more unsettling. Modern institutions often preserve their own contradictions in meticulous detail, then rely on delay, procedure, fragmentation, and sheer bulk to keep those contradictions from becoming common knowledge. That is why the record still disturbs. Not because it is empty, because it is full. And somewhere in that mass of numbered pages, accession codes, and quiet boxes, the official version continues to sit beside the longer one, waiting for someone patient enough to read past the surface.